Hi, everyone. For those that are logging on, thank you so much for joining us. We're just going to wait for a few more minutes until we get a few more people on board. But while we're waiting, welcome everyone. And if you could start by just adding your name and where you're from and the stakeholder group that you're with into the chat so that we can start the conversation. Thanks so much. There's a few names there I recognize. Thank you, everyone, for coming along. Hi, Em. Thought you'd be there. Nice to see you. I can see Claire, Danielle, lots of people that we know. Welcome, everyone. Oh, hi, Mahi. Long time no chat. Bron, nice to see you guys. Oh, hi, Lee. Good to see you guys. South Pole, gosh, we're moving out. That's wonderful. That's awesome. Greta, gosh, there's lots. Hey, Claire. Lots of people coming online. We've got 53 and they're all coming on, which is wonderful. Hello, Joe from Ghana country. Me too. So yes, just as we kept going, everyone that's coming in, please just pop your name down and where you're located. It'd be great if you could also add in there what group you're with, or if you're with council or NGO, it'd be wonderful if you could add all that in. We'll just give it one more minute for everyone to come on in. Just while we're getting everyone online, I would just like to introduce the people in front of you. We've got Dr. Scott Wilson. We're going to hear more about Scott in just a little while. He's the research director of AUSMAP. We have Taylor Shaw. She's our project and event manager, and she is also going to be the moderator for the Q&A session. So as we go through today, please jot down your questions in the chat function. She'll be moderating those questions, and we're going to have a wonderful Q&A at the end of this session. We've also got Marias behind the scenes for any tech support. So if you have any issues or any problems, please jot those down or message us individually. We'd just like to let you know, though, that the presentation is being recorded and it will be available on our website after the after the webinar. I read effect and then said effect. And I think that's it in terms of housekeeping. We're just going to wait for one more minute to get everybody in online, and that will be wonderful. So reach out and sit back and enjoy, and I hope you learn something new today. All right, Dr. Scott, I think we'll get going.
Sure.
First of all, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands and waters of which we're working and meeting on today. We do pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging, and celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal peoples and their ongoing cultures and connections to the land and waterways. We also acknowledge and pay our respect to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait peoples that are joining us with us today. And I'm sitting here on Ghana land of the Adelaide Plains. So thank you everyone for coming along. So the way we are going to run this webinar today, I'm going to have a quick chat about AUSMAP, and hopefully most of you know about AUSMAP, but if not, you're going to learn a little bit more and how we are helping put microplastics on the map. I'm going to then throw to Scott, and he's going to talk about the plastic crisis that we're in right now. What are microplastics? Where are they coming from? And how, most importantly, and that's why we're here, talk about the impact on us and on the environment. And then we're going to finish with a wonderful Q&A session, and we're going to talk about how you can help and make your decisions as consumers, and finish with, as I said, a wonderful session. And I look forward to the questions that we're going to come out of this, and the discussion that's ahead of us for the next hour. Thanks so much. So AUSMAP, for those that don't know, we are a global, wish we were global, maybe one day. We are a nationwide citizen science program that's run out of the Total Environment Centre, which is one of the longest environmental centres in Australia, based out of Sydney, but we are national. We've been going since 2018, and we are a citizen science program that uses a scientific methodology to be able to quantify, monitor, and assess microplastics on our shorelines. And we then use that information to engage and educate and empower local communities and find effective solutions to these microplastic issues. So in the last few years, we've been very successful. We're a very small team. You're looking at the bulk of the team right here, and we do have Natasha Franklin on board as well. She's out there today, who's our science officer. So we've now collected about 750 samples from around the country. We have one of the largest databases, if not the largest database of microplastics nationally. We've collected over 350 sites nationwide. We've trained over 1,500 citizen scientists, which is really important because we use a strict scientific methodology. So everyone's collecting data the same way so we can compare between sites. We've engaged well over 8,000 people in our program. And most importantly, we've removed well over 7 million pieces from our shorelines. And we're looking at microplastics between 1 and 5 millimeters. So that's a lot of small bits of plastic that we're removing. So our expertise has been developed quite a lot over the last few years. As I've mentioned, we do have the largest database that's publicly available on as our hotspot map online. And we use that to monitor and assess microplastics on our shorelines. It doesn't have to be a beach, it can be a lake. We work very closely in wetlands, in mangroves, along rivers. And we use that information to be able to offer solutions and source reduction to land and water managers. That's really important. And we're working with a lot of councils and local governments across the nation to do just that. More recently, in the last couple of years, we've expanded our program and we've designed a methodology where we can map and quantify the loss of rubber crumb or synthetic infill and synthetic grass from play fields and playgrounds. And we've been working with Tangaroa Blue up in Queensland with that. And we've extended that quite a lot across New South Wales and coming up with quite alarming results. If you are interested in that topic, we do have a webinar on our website that you can learn more about that. We also do a lot of eco-talks and understanding of impacts nationally, and we work with university partners across the nation for that. But most importantly, it's all about science education and engagement and empowering and using this information to create change for long-term behaviour change. So I think without further ado, I'm going to throw to Dr. Wilson, and he is going to talk about microplastic and us.
Thanks, Michelle, and hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. When we first talked amongst the team around the idea of running another webinar, we talked around what to talk about and what to cover. And there's been quite a bit of change happening since we last ran a webinar last year. So this talk is really covering some of the latest findings and more around, what's happening in terms of us, human health impacts, and obviously the changes that are going on legislatively as well. We'll touch on that. So obviously you're probably all aware that, we are really in a plastic crisis now. The production of plastic globally continues to increase, from 320 million tonnes per year. That's projected to triple or quadruple over the next 20 or 30 years. So there's kind of no end to this issue. And interestingly, as a commercial product, plastic's been around since the 1950s or earlier, in fact, but as a commercial product widely. What we do know is a plastic that is out in the environment that hasn't been collected is still there since the 1950s till today. And the lifespan of the plastics, while plastic is a great commodity and has great durability, that also creates issues from an environmental and potential health perspective. So we really are in a plastic crisis. And people say, well, you know, plastic's not the big issue, right? You know, we've got biodiversity loss, we've got, you know, global warming issues, and so we've got bigger fish to fry, so to speak. And what, you know, we know is plastic is actually contributing to both of those issues. So they can't be really looked at in isolation. And I've just included some figures here that in terms of plastics contributing to global warming, it's about 200 gigatons equivalent CO2 per year, based on the raw materials, the extracting of the raw materials, and the production of the plastics are the main drivers of those emissions. As you can see, you know, the percentages there from that. So most of it is from the production phase. A little bit comes, you know, in the recycling, incineration, and or landfilling, 6% of the total of that 2 gigaton. To put that in perspective, the total CO2 emissions from industry and energy sources is about 38 or close to 39 gigatons. So plastics makes up over 5% of the emissions, you know, the total emissions, CO2 equivalent emissions. So while it's not, you know, a big part, it is still a significant part, and, you know, we need to acknowledge that. As Michelle mentioned, with AUSMAP, we do work around the small stuff, the microplastics. And so the issue with plastics is once it's aged and or been in the environment for a while, it basically breaks up, not down, is our saying. So we need to remember that, you know, the longevity of this is these plastic products are going to outlive us. And so that creates, you know, the microplastic and now these nanoplastics that we're seeing. So it just continues to fragment over time, getting to smaller and smaller bits, not breaking down to its base minerals. And so just to clarify some of those definitions in terms of size ranges, you know, microplastics is anything less than 5 millimeters, all the way down to 0.001 of a millimeter, from when, you know, nanoplastics then take off. For AUSMAP, as Michelle mentioned also, that, you know, we're a citizen science program, so we can't look, you know, we can't get everyone to look at the really small size class. So we just look at the 1 to 5 mil sizes. So we do take samples and work with industry partners at looking at those small size classes as well. So hopefully that gives you some ideas. Anything greater than 5 millimeters for the purposes, you know, we call macroplastics. And of course, you know, we should be also aware that microplastics don't just come from the breakup of bigger products. There's a range of microplastic sources, which you can see in the slide here, that we're either intentionally adding to products, and the one you're probably familiar with or might have heard about is microbeads that were added to various hygiene products, cleansing products. And so every time you cleaned your teeth or washed your face with these products, these little beads went down, you know, the sink and out through the wastewater stream and into our environments, potentially either directly into the water or via the kind of the sludge that ends up being applied to our lands. So that's a intentional microplastic. Obviously, a lot of our clothing now is synthetic, in essence, plastics, so nylons and things like that, acrylics. And so, you know, we lose fibers every day, and particularly in our wash cycle through that. Michelle mentioned synthetic turf and rubber crumb as being one area we focus on. And so our tires is another source. So the rubber that are used in all those is synthetic or a mixture of synthetic and natural rubber. And so in essence, we're driving around on plastic tires, playing our sports on plastic fields, and our kids are playing on playgrounds that are made of plastic. So there's lots of sources of microplastics to our environment, not just, the big stuff breaking up. And of course, it's not just the plastics that we need to be concerned about. The plastics are polymers, and they're generally relatively inert, and is why they were seen as such a great product, and still are a great product. And we should acknowledge that we couldn't be where we are in society without plastics. It's just that the plastics has got to a point that there's good plastics and kind of plastics that are less useful, such as our single-use plastics. But also that when to make these products, there's a range of additives to them. Some of them are functional, as you can see there. So they could be a flame retardant, they could be a biocide, they could be a lubricant or a plasticizer as examples. They're colorants, there's fillers, there's reinforcement, things like the glass fibers that we use in fiberglass. So when you have a plastic product, there's a range of chemicals and additives that are added in there that we also need to be mindful of and aware of the potential harms that those additives are also having. And of course, the other issue with plastics is that they absorb a lot of other things from the surrounding environment wherever they are. So whether it be plastic floating around in the waterway, for instance, will be absorbing if there's heavy metals there, pesticides, antibiotics. All these have been shown to be attached to those plastics. So when those plastics are then ingested, so that the animal is potentially getting obviously the polymer, the plastic, it's getting the additives that have been included in that product, and potentially a range or a cocktail, as it says there, of other contaminants. And so really there is a cause for concern with the chemicals and the polymer itself entering into animals' bodies, and obviously potentially our bodies, which I'll talk about in a minute. I will say that although the plastics act as sponges, when we look at that compared to, say, natural particles that are in our waterways, such as algae or sediments, those natural particles will actually absorb more of other contaminants on it. So we need to put it into perspective that although they do act as sponges, the plastics, there's a range of other things within that environment that could also be causing harm. So a fish ingesting a bit of plastic as opposed to some sediment, you have to weigh up the balance there. And so what we do know from studies is that pristine plastics, microplastics, absorb less than aged microplastics. So and it's to do with the binding. You can see the charges there on there. So it's electrostatic charging that attracts these things to it. And so as a plastic ages, it becomes more charged, or it has a greater affinity for absorbing contaminants. So getting a plastic out of the environment as soon as possible is better than leaving it there, of course. But stopping it in the first place is definitely the best solution. So I just wanted to show that there to put that into perspective as well. Of course, so we know plastics are out there. We see it every day. And I'm sure everyone's now seen images like this from a whole range of species, that we're finding plastics ingested in. So from fish to birds to turtles are all being impacted. So in fact, there's pretty much any species that we look at, is ingesting these plastics. So it really is the whole food chain in our aquatic systems, and it can move through. And so while plastic is most of the polymers are buoyant initially, and I'm sure you all heard about these large floating garbage patches out at in the oceans. What happens over time, and it's the same with microplastic, is they do end up sinking to the bottom. And so in fact, there's probably more plastic on the bottom than there is in our surface waters. And so that happens over time just because they get algal growth on it, and it changes the buoyancy of those plastics. And as they deteriorate, they kind of just sink to the bottom. What that means is that all organisms within the water column, not just those at the surface, can be exposed to these plastics. And of course, once they're on the sea bottom, there's a chance for that to be resuspended, particularly in nearshore or estuarine environments, probably less so in the deep ocean waters. But so the plastics move through the food chain, and as I said, there's evidence from plankton, through to whales of plastic ingestion being evident. So the natural question then is, how does that affect us? Does it affect us? And how are we being exposed to it? So obviously there's the seafood that I mentioned is a big chance of that. But there's been some studies done all over the world looking at microplastics in different food and beverage products. And you can see there, we've included some numbers there to give you an idea of how much you might be exposed to. So for instance, in a spoonful of sugar, 20 grams, the studies have shown that there's just one, on average, one piece of microplastic in that spoonful. When you look at honey, it's 13. When you look at salt, it's 14. We know there's microplastic in our waters, both in our bottled water and our tap water. But in bottled water, there's definitely more than in tap water. And interesting enough, when you compare the amounts in bottled water to beer, there's half the amount of plastics in beer per equivalent servings, 250 mils. So that's why I'm advocating for beer as the new beverage of choice. Of course, that's up to you. I'm not advocating directly, but anyway. There has been studies done on wine, Michelle, you would also be happy to know. And what they found is that the wine, now they've moved to the capped wine bottles, that actually, the cap creates microplastics because it's got a little plastic seal on the inside of it. So the old cork bottles have less or close to zero microplastics. So if you can still find a corked wine bottle, go for that. There's some tips. Sorry, I digress. So there's a range of sources coming through our food and beverage items, but it's not just from what we consume, it's also in the air we breathe as well. And there's been studies done looking at how much particles there are. And as you probably can imagine, in enclosed spaces, so in our homes, in our schools, in our offices, there's more microplastics than in the outdoors. It makes sense, it's that dilution factor. And so you can see the numbers there. On average, 75 particles per 50 cubic meters as opposed to 3,000 indoors. So what can we do? Interestingly, I was involved in a study a few years ago with a student of mine who looked at indoor homes and found, firstly, that carpeted homes have more microplastics than floored homes, like tiled or wood floors. And she found that if you vacuum more frequently, so if you're vacuuming weekly as opposed to fortnightly or more or less frequently, then you're actually reducing how much microplastics there are in your home. So makes sense, cleaning your home and removing the microplastics from the floor surface, is obviously one way to get rid of it, or to reduce your exposure. So obviously food, beverage, and air are the major pathways of it getting into our body. And the more you spend potentially indoors or consuming certain food and beverage products like bottled water, then you're exposing yourself to more microplastics than otherwise. The third potential source is through absorption to the skin. So we apply creams, sunscreens, for instance, have microplastics. And so are those plastics in those products coming through our skin? Potentially, it's probably the less likely route because our dermal surface is quite thick and the particles need to be really small to get through. So when we look at size does matter in terms of impacts or potential movement into our body. What we do know that there's no absorption of microplastics into our body if the particles are greater than 150 microns. So we might ingest a plastic particle, but it won't move across the stomach or intestinal wall into our body. What we do know is as the plastics get smaller, so we see it moving into our organs when it's around 20 microns, and then once it's kind of down to 0.1 of a micron or 100 nanometers in size, then pretty much it can cross blood-brain barriers, placental barriers, and move around our body more readily. So the smaller it is, the more dangerous it is the simple message there. So what happens once it's in our body? So, we know the major routes are through our gut or breathing it in. Probably the stomach is the most readily absorbed pathway. The movement of particles into our body through endocytosis and things like that. So we know that occurs more readily than in our lungs, but it can occur through our lungs as well for the fine nanoplastics. And so it will move in, and once it's in, it gets into our bloodstream, and there's been lots of papers of late showing it in our bloodstream. And so once it's in our bloodstream, it's being moved through the whole body. Now, interestingly, our body will metabolize some of those plastics. So as you think, like our defense system, our leukocytes, our macrophages act as bodyguards for foreign objects in our body, diseases they attack and things like that. They'll also attack plastics. So we know that they'll kind of digest those. They'll take them to the areas of the body where it can be excreted. So there is a process that some of these plastics are metabolized and then excreted out. So through our spleen and liver are major kind of process units for excretion, and so that will then get excreted out. And there's been studies showing that we're seeing microplastics in feces, so there's evidence of it moving through our body. The half-life, there's been studies done more with rats and mice, but they're showing the half-life. So by feeding these mice with microplastics, they found that the half-life is pretty short for microplastics in their bodies. You know, it's kind of hours to days, depending on the concentration and obviously the size of the microplastics. What we find is the bigger microplastics actually are expelled quicker than the smaller microplastics. And so the half-life is short, but because we are constantly being bombarded, you know, by plastics, there's kind of almost a continual intake of plastic. So we're never truly removing it from our body. But if given the chance, yeah, the body will remove most of those plastics, not all, most. And this is, I'll get to that in a minute. So, as I said, there's been recent studies showing that it's in the various tissues in our bloodstream. It's making it to the heart and to the brain. Interestingly, as I said, it can cross placental barriers, and so it's being transferred to young babies in utero, and also recently born babies through mother's breast milk. So there is, you know, we are passing it on, I suppose, either directly from, you know, the environment or through mothers. So the health effects, most of the studies around what that is, what's the actual impact to us from having the plastics in the body? Yes, it's there. Yes, it can move around. Yes, it can be excreted. There's been a range of studies, once again, using surrogate species. They're shown that it causes, you know, inflammation. It can cause reproductive toxicity. It can cause, you know, cancer and things like that. These are all, most of these have been done with, as I said, rat, mice, rabbit, you know, these other animals. And so, it, you know, while we're seeing effects there, we really need to consider a precautionary approach and reduce our exposure until we know more. Now, what's happened more recently, there's been some interesting studies with humans that have come out this year. So there was one study that looked at people with plaque or clogged arteries, and when they looked at those patients, you know, 56% of the patients had microplastics. So, right, let's say about half of the people that had clogged arteries. So it was a smallish study. It was about 250 people. So about half of them had microplastics in their arteries. Interestingly, they followed that up, you know, those people, and after 36 months post when they did the initial observations, there was a higher percentage of stroke or fatality from those people that had microplastics in their clogged arteries. Now, that doesn't necessarily say there's a cause and effect, but there's an association there that needs to be explored further. So as I said, it was a small study, but it needs follow-up, and I'm sure the researchers are doing work in that space. There's also been some work looking at cancer cells. So while this wasn't done like with whole humans, it was done on cancer cell lines, human cancer cell lines. They were able to show, interestingly, that firstly, so cancer cells do accumulate microplastic like other parts of the body, and those cancer cells tended to retain the microplastics more than other cells. And then as they divided, as you know, cancer growth is kind of uncontrolled growth of cells, they were able to pass those microplastics on to their daughter cells, their divided cells. Okay. And so once again, there was some suggestions in that study that where plastics are present, then cancer growth is greater. Once again, cause and effect not necessarily linked there, but further work is needed to understand the relationships between cancer growth and microplastic association. Similarly, there's been some work done with looking at patients with liver disease, cirrhosis, and once again, those patients had the ones that are heavily diseased livers had high levels of microplastics. So once again, there's some association there that needs further work. So these are studies that have all come out recently showing that maybe there is some association and some effects that we really need to be cautious about exposing ourselves to. Just conscious about time. So we're going to, what's happening, to control all this. So there's been some recent changes that we'd like to highlight for you. That's happening around the world, nothing in Australia as yet. But the EU Parliament last year passed some regulations that look specifically at microplastics and restricting their use, either as standalone products, things like glitter, banning glitter, which is a microplastic, or intentionally added to products. So things like the microplastics in the cosmetics, microplastics in synthetic sports fields. So the rubber crumb, for instance, has been banned from artificial turf fields, will be banned. There's a more kind of a grace period. But so these are things. So the EU is kind of probably a step ahead of anyone else globally in introducing specific bans on microplastics. Another jurisdiction that's leading the way is California in the US. They're the first authority to legally require monitoring of microplastics in drinking water. So the Californian Water Board, they started their monitoring last year. They've got a 2-year period where they're doing quarterly monitoring of all the water supplies in California. So there's 30 odd water supplies that they're measuring. They're going to then evaluate kind of what the levels are like and kind of go from there. But anyway, it's legislated that they have to monitor. And so that's the first one that's kind of doing that once again globally. And then the third major legislative aspect is the Global Plastic Treaty to reduce plastic pollution. That's in negotiation at the moment. It will be finalised next year. They've come up with a treaty text, a draft treaty text that will be discussed at the next meeting. I was lucky enough to be at the Paris meeting last year of that. And that will specifically, in terms of, it's looking at the whole plastics life cycle and reducing, the potential for plastic pollution across that whole life cycle. But particularly microplastics are being mentioned, and they'll appear. Once again, there'll be things like intentionally added microplastics we're looking to get included as a legislative piece. Short-lived single-use plastics will definitely be mentioned. And then polymers and chemicals of concern within those plastics or as plastics are also being discussed. How that pans out and what that looks like, we still don't know for sure, but it is something that once it's legislated, we'll get, it'll be a global international treaty of which Australia will then be a party. Australia has actually been quite proactive and is in what they call the High Ambition Coalition. So they're trying for the strongest treaty possible. So watch this space. But once that is international law, then there'll be domestic legislation passed as well. Okay, so let's briefly talk about what you guys can do. So I've been giving you a lot of kind of doom and gloom, and hopefully with this legislation we can get some changes going on at the upper levels, but we can be doing stuff now to help. So one of the major sources of microplastics to the water, to our environment, is from clothing. Approximately 2,000 fibers per article per wash cycle are coming off these synthetic garments. So we can install devices, and the good catch is a local product that's currently being developed that will be a filter for your washing machine. There's also other things like the guppy bag where you can put your synthetic sportswear in that, and it'll trap the microplastic fibers. So over time, I think we'll find this be legislated, but in the meantime, this is a good alternative. Some simple measures such as not using plastic chopping boards, getting rid of Teflon coated cookware, because the Teflon is a plastic coating, plus it has PFAS, which is nasty chemicals. So there's good alternatives to those. And then just everyday items, pegs, the floss, there's natural flosses, the sushi fish, and reusable wipes are all examples that we can potentially find on the market, or we are on the market. In fact, we sell some actually through our AUSMAP store, so you can look into that. Of course, bottled water is probably a big no-no, and we have a great supply in Australia of good drinking water from our taps. If you are concerned of what's coming through the taps, then install one of those filters on the taps. That's going to remove over 90% of your microplastics. So there's a good site that we recommend to be a conscientious consumer. It's called Beat the Microbead. You can put in a product code or a name, and it'll tell you if it's got microplastics or not. So that's a good site to think about. Okay, so how does this all then relate back to AUSMAP? So obviously AUSMAP, we're trying to monitor and assess the condition of our waterways. So we're raising awareness on the amounts of microplastic out there and the types, and that we map that through our hotspot map. We, as Michelle mentioned at the top, we also do source tracking and reduction strategy. So that then is, we're trying to stop it at the source. That's the best way. Obviously, raising awareness and education is important to that. And really, it's about leveraging, you people, the citizen scientists, and working with the stakeholders for effective solutions. So we're all part of the problem, but we can also be part of the solution as well. So I think that's all I had to say, and we can throw it open to Q&A. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much to Dr. Michelle and Dr. Scott for that really insightful conversation. We are going to dive a little bit deeper now by answering some questions. So if anyone does have a question relating to microplastics, AUSMAP, human health, pop it in that Q&A box and I will get through them as we go. I'm going to jump in. We have one here from Matt from the Maritime Museum, and he was just curious to know if there is an immune response to micro/nanoplastics. Do you know anything about this so far, Scott, in the research?
Yeah, there's been a few studies. I mean, we know it causes inflammation, Matt. So there's definitely a response in the body. In terms of larger immune issues, system-wide issues, probably we don't know that at this stage. As I said, those white blood cells definitely attack and pick up the microplastic. So that's part of our immune system and immune response. So the body is great at defending itself. And so I suppose yes is the answer somewhat. Hopefully that answers.
Great, thank you. We have another one here, which is quite interesting. An anonymous person has asked, I wonder if Lifeblood could test for microplastics in blood donations, even if random small samples. And I guess that could also lead into how are microplastics tested for within these samples? What kind of technology, I guess, do they use to test?
Yeah, I mean, it would be great, wouldn't it, to look at testing blood samples. You know, people are donating blood. Yeah, maybe in the future this is a requirement that your blood doesn't have X amount of microplastics. I don't know, but if there is a safe level, but how that's tested is so reliably microplastics can be tested down to about 5 microns, 1 micron maybe, in size, and it's using at the moment there's a range of techniques. The most common one is kind of the spectrophotometer technique. So there's Raman or infrared. So there's other techniques to kind of record. So we use the same method to measure what's in your blood as it is to measure in the water or the sediments. There's some tweaking, but so we're not changing techniques to measure what's in our blood, for instance.
There we go. Amazing. We just have one that's come through in the chat from Karen. She was just wondering if there has been any progress in the New South Wales, in the New South Wales Plastic Action Plan and the EPA litter check and litter reduction program.
Yeah, thanks, Karen. In terms of microplastics, do you mean? I think.
Yeah, I think that should be in terms of microplastics. Yeah.
No. So unfortunately, microplastics are not considered litter under the New South Wales EPA, and so while microplastics are mentioned in the Plastic Action Plan, and I think AUSMAP was mentioned specifically at one stage as an approach, that there's nothing. Sorry, I shouldn't say there's nothing. There's been some development on the side where Department of Climate Change, Energy, Water, and whatever else they call themselves now, the New South Wales one, they're monitoring microplastics in estuaries. So there has been some government response, and they're monitoring estuaries up and down the state, monitoring microplastics in estuaries up and down the state. So in terms of developments, that's probably the latest that I can let you know about.
No worries. This is a good one for Michelle, actually, because I know you met with the lady that is organising it, but someone's asked they've said, I have been using a Planet Care filter on my washing machine from the UK. How can we get the details on the local one that's being produced?
Yeah, fantastic. It is a local product. The name of the lady is not in my brain right at this moment, but if you contact us through the info@ausmap.org email, I can put you in touch with her. It is a local product that she has developed, and she has now got it in 100 Good Guy stores across the country, and I believe it would be coming in about now because I'd spoken to her a month or so ago. It's basically made up of the guppy bag. Now she knows that it's not going to capture everything, but our solution to that is to use a guppy bag as well as this filter. It's only relatively cheap, and so it's pretty easy to put on your washing machine. So get in touch, and perhaps we can add it to our website as well, just so that you can contact this lady directly.
Thanks, Michelle. This is an interesting question from Toby. He's asking, a number of products are now available in sheet form. So we've got like the laundry detergent, the dishwasher, toilet cleaner, all these sorts of things now. Are these good alternatives to the use of other products in the market and in use relative to microplastics?
In sheet form?
Yeah, so I know that you can buy the laundry sheets now that you can pop in your washing machine. I know that we had a chat in the office about this and about the polyvinyl. Is that correct? material, and whether they still contain microplastics or whether they are kind of the preferred option in terms of the plastic container. Yeah.
Great question, Scott.
Yeah, I mean, what I'd say with any of these products is do your kind of due diligence on what they're made from, what ingredients they may have in them. This goes through everything. So something that there's, for instance, with some of the cosmetics and there's what's called dissolvable microplastics or polymers and non-dissolvable. So what's happening in the EU is they're only legislating for the solid ones, not the dissolvable, because they think they'll all break down. But there's some evidence to show that the dissolvable, even though they dissolve, they only dissolve to kind of a nanoplastic scale, and so they don't actually biodegrade. So some do, but we've got to be careful about being sold that these products are environmentally friendly when we're not. So so anyway, yes, be mindful, and check the ingredients. Use that Beat the Bead microbead site.
I'll just add too, I just saw a question pop up there about what to look for. With any of these products, poly, P-O-L-Y, is the nickname, so to speak, of plastic. So in cosmetics or in washing detergents like PVA, which is what we're talking about now, it's polychloride, polyvinyl alcohol. So poly would refer to plastic. So if you look on the back of any of these products, and if you see the word poly, then it has plastics within it.
Potentially, yeah.
Potentially.
Perfect. And we have a question in the chat function about recycling. So it's, may I know about the recycling opportunities around Australia, and what are the steps we can take to recycle our plastic wastages? Because I guess every state kind of has different options and things. So can you maybe give a bit of a rundown, Scott or Michelle, whoever wants to jump on that one?
I'll let Michelle jump into that first.
All right. Okay. Well, yeah, as Taylor said, look, everywhere you go, I'm in Adelaide, and, we have opportunities for FOGO, which is food organic and green organics, but every place you go to, and we know recently we've done a lot of travel up in northern Western Australia, and the opportunity for recycling is difficult. I know over here in South Australia, one of the facilities that are taking our mixed plastic and recycling it back into industrial pellets that Scott mentioned before, plastic feedstock, and then is using those products, those pellets, to create other plastic items, have just been awarded a very big federal grant to take soft plastics. So that's going to be happening hopefully in the next year or so. However, I was going to talk about this in a little while, but recycling is not the way to go. We have to just rethink our consumer choices nowadays, and we have to really try and think about products that can be particularly plastic, that we don't have to rely on recycling. So going back to the laundry powder, buying a powder in a box is probably your best option because that box can get remade back into a box, as opposed to a plastic bottle that may or may not get recycled depending on where you are. So it's just about that consumer choice and rethinking our recycling options.
Absolutely.
Scott, do you have anything else to add?
No, I'm happy with that.
Beautiful. And we are running out of time, so just a few more questions. But leading off from that, there's an interesting question from Joe that says that there are some articles that do suggest plastic recycling can be a big generator of microplastics. Given that there's a recent federal funding for soft plastics, as you just mentioned, Michelle, are there best practice industry examples of how to avoid losing microplastics to the environment during the recycling process? Michelle, Scott, who wants to
I'll jump in there, and I think I know who's asking this question. So, okay, so there is obviously the threat of losing microplastics into the environment, and we've been studying one place over here in South Australia for a number of years, and the idea of bringing in all that soft plastic to be able to get recycled, which is a fantastic initiative. It's definitely got to happen, without a doubt, but we need to make sure that we put into place in these plastic facilities, whether it's a mixed recycling facility or more so the facilities that create granules out of these bigger products. And then there's a very strict process of reduction strategies put into place within these facilities that needs to be legislated and enforced by local authorities to ensure that this loss is not occurring, which we see quite a lot down here in South Australia. So I think that is the biggest. We need legislation and enforcement with this nationwide for it to work into the future.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I'll just add that there's no current standards,
No.
so that's something that's lacking.
Yeah, absolutely. And another thing on the recycled plastic, Eva has asked, what are your thoughts about the rise of recycled plastic clothing and products? I've always been very wary with them as the material is not being used in the way that it was initially designed for. So is there concern with choosing a recycled product over a virgin plastic product? Do we think there's any concern between the two of them?
It depends on the product, I suppose. On the quality of how that product, the recycled product, is made. We know that some recycled products release more microplastics than, say, a product made out of virgin polymers. But it's to do with the quality of the production usually, rather than the product itself, if you know, the polymer itself. So that would be probably my comment on that. Choose wisely.
Yeah, nice. And this is a great question for one of the final questions is from Claire. She says, hello, I'm a postgraduate student and I am wondering if there's any volunteering or work opportunities with AUSMAP to conquer the microplastic problem.
We're always looking for fantastic volunteers, Claire. So please get in touch. We're a nationwide program. Most of the team is based in Sydney. I'm in Adelaide. We've got great volunteers and networks in WA, Victoria and Tassie. So please get in touch and it'll be wonderful to touch base.
Absolutely. And I guess my final question to you all, to you both, is if there is one thing that you could give as a takeaway from today. We've obviously talked over so many different topics. Is there kind of one summary thing that you would suggest people could take away from today to do their best within the microplastic space?
Like you go first and then I'll follow up.
Okay. It's always a hard question because I feel there's many things we can be doing at the one time. So it's not as simple as one thing. But I suppose being a mindful consumer really is a good start. Checking the ingredients list if they have them, doing your research. I know it's time consuming and sometimes the information is not clear. But we have the power as consumers to change what we consume. And so by being mindful consumers, we are directing that change indirectly.
Absolutely.
Michelle?
And I think I'll finish off with that in just saying that absolutely rethinking our options, but also, we as a non-for-profit 100% grant funded project, it's projects like ours that create change through behaviour, through education and engagement. When we started 6 years ago, we had 1 year's worth of funding, and now 6 years on, we're still going. And when we first started this program, very few people knew what microplastics were, let alone started the understanding of it. And although I'm a PhD, my background's not in microplastic, unlike Scott, who's an ecotoxicologist. And I've seen the change happening, and with the knowledge comes power. So I think if you look at impact further, for every dollar that you may potentially spend buying a keep cup, for example, put it to a program like ours where we can use that money and to be able to expand our program further throughout the country and fill in those gaps, find where the hotspots are, and most importantly, find where those sources are so we can stop them before any more microplastics end up in our waterways. So on that note, I will finish off I would just like to say thank you to my team, wonderful team that we are collaboratively, and also the fact that our mission is to curb microplastic pollution by leveraging citizen scientists and finding effective solutions and creating a demand for change through innovation and collaboration. So if you are out there and interested in collaborating and learning more about the program or being involved, there's lots of opportunities. Taylor's created all those wonderful QR codes. Get in touch, and we'd love to collaborate with you guys further. So thank you everybody for coming. We had a total of 78 people online today, which is wonderful. We hope you all learned something new, and we look forward to the next one that we're able to give to you. Thank you so much.
Bye, everyone.